Yeah, thanks, Sue, and good afternoon, everyone. Last week, and in fact, so far, we have been talking about techniques in development associated effectively at the individual. It's at the individual level. We've not really looked so far at what happens if we actually want to try and apply things whole scale across an organization. And I don't necessarily mean a huge organization. Really, as soon as we start to talk about organizing, development organizing, upskilling, if you want to call it that, for a number of people. And we do have to start to look at how we would go about doing that and why we would invite some people to do certain development. So it's fine to talk about to the person about their development. Perhaps at the end of a performance appraisal discussion, we're talking about what additional skills and knowledge, their competencies and behaviors that they need. But that's not going to make huge change. That's not going to look at it from the organization level. And so today is about the organization level. Now, you've got some of the slides in your workbook, but not others. So it might be worthwhile making some notes. But the principal slide, in fact, the major slide that I want to use, is certainly there. So without more ado, let's away. First, I want to illustrate where we're going. It's one of those where I want to tell you the answer and then go ahead and tell you the story about how we get to the answer. What we're looking at is the final outcome, a competency framework for the whole firm. Now, in this particular case, what I've done, the thing is done in this particular one is done in Excel. Excel seems eminently useful for this. And I've selected three snapshots, three screen grabs, and it shows you on the top left a competency. Competency, a requirement to be competent in economic and markets modeling, estimating contribution at the radio spectrum. It happens to be an organization associated with this thing called the radio spectrum, but really it doesn't matter what it is. Estimating the contribution that the radio spectrum makes to economy, security, and society. That's quite a big thing, and it requires you to be very competent in modeling and economic modeling and the likes. That's the competency, so we've grabbed that. We then say, quite importantly, where it comes from, and that's in the policies and the ops and management plan. And then we get down to the roles that need that competency. And you'll see those there. I'll explain more when we get to it, and I'll show you the actual competency framework, illustrate how it's used, etc. But I want to just show you that's where we're going. So let's see how we get there and the steps that are needed along the way. Now, in effect, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to ask the question, what capability does the organization need? We know that it might have a certain capability today. It might be making particular profits, or it might be providing whatever service. It's doing something today. And we know the reason why we're interested in developing is, of course, that we want it to do something else tomorrow. So there's a today's state, an as-is state, and there's a to-be state, a tomorrow state. And it's that tomorrow state that we're particularly interested in grasping. And the as-is state, today's state, of course, tells us where we are. So the difference between the two gives us a gap. So the question then is, well, how? How do we do this? We haven't been here before. So the only way that we can do it is to model. Now, I'm using here a particular type of modeling. Those of you who've been on some of these webinars before, particularly in other trimesters, will have seen me use this type of modeling before. This is out of a science called systems dynamics, and what it's about here is that we see, for example, that if you look at the bottom right, investment leads to product management, which leads to product design, which leads to production methods, which leads to production, which leads to delivery, etc., all the way around to profit. And you can fill in, this is just an example organization. This would be unique to your organization. You would build one, and this is the sort of stuff we do. You would build one of these for your organization. And so then we can say, well, you need a capability in. and we can pick any one of these. Product design. We need a capability. You need a capability in product design. You're doing one thing today, you need a different capability tomorrow. And then we can ask, what technology and competencies, and by the way, I'm using competencies to include behaviors, what technology, what competencies do we need in order to excel at product design, to do what we need to do in product design? And we need, therefore, the model in order to ask that question, in order to define what we need at that stage, in order to define the competencies that we need for the organization. We're not at the individual level, we're right up in the clouds at the moment, and we're asking big questions like, what capability does the organization need, before we start asking anything about the specific competencies. Now, we'll get to the competencies in a moment, but you also need to recognize that in order to achieve a capability, for example, in product design, in order to achieve that capability, we need a balance between machine function, and of course we know a lot these days about automation and artificial intelligence, so we know that there's a lot of machine function stuff in there, and that's balanced with the human that's going to use the machines. So you've got a balance between human competence and machine function. And of course, if we go back to the spectrum management thing that we're talking about, we can automate a lot of that. And we can choose to invest in automation, or we can choose to invest in human competence. And that really is back, we started with that quite some time ago, I think, on the business case for development. And we can start to make that case because we can trade off spending in human competence development and spending in machine function and automation and the like. So we have to also, for every capability, we have to remember that we are looking at a specific human competence for a specific machine function. Change machine function, we need to change the human competence. If we can't achieve the human competence, maybe we could automate more. And there's always that balance. So continuing the theme of why would we want to do it, I mentioned that there's this idea of a business case, and we talked about that. Just to say that there's also, revisiting the reasons why we might do it, we're also able to grow motivation, and that's one of the big ones that we said that we've said in the past. One of the things that comes out of this is motivation, because learning increases self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is a motivator. And similarly, if we can achieve more in the job because we are more capable, we are more able to do, we have higher competency, that increases achievement, that gives greater job satisfaction. So lots of good reasons for doing it. That's enough on we won't go into that anymore on why. What we need to also know is who. Who are we dealing with here at this? We've talked about individual development and what makes people developable and the likes. So the implication there is that you sit down with an individual as a manager and you discuss what they're going to do, and you come up with the idea that perhaps there's some development needed, and they're going to go away and do that development themselves. Great. Maybe the manager is going to actually invest. But when it gets to this kind of pan-organization activity, then clearly self-management might have a role, and you might want it to be self-managed ultimately, but you really have to look at the line manager, the manager of the firm, and maybe even a specialist, maybe even a consultant or specialist manager. And big firms, of course, have L&D departments to do this type of thing. But really, you need to be looking at doing this management centrally, so that everything is balanced together. And if you're lacking in some area, maybe someone else, some other employee, some other member of staff can actually supply the competency that's required. So it's a balancing act across the whole organization. So how do we do it? What are the essential pieces to putting together a competency framework? Well, one thing, and this is my all-time favorite slide, this is Charlie Brown and and Snoopy, and you can see it there, fooled by the job description. Job descriptions are everything in this, because that modeling that I just showed you, that spawns the requirement for jobs. I didn't give you that link, but that's the modeling, the systems dynamic modeling gives you a capability required. That capability, that function, that activity suggests a job, and you can then build the jobs from that. Those jobs should be defined in job descriptions, because that's what you're saying you need. So in effect, a company is an amalgam of all its job descriptions. So, 20 people in a company, perhaps there are 8 or 10 job descriptions. Those define what's required. So the first thing we do need to have is a job description which says, given that capability, these are the jobs we need doing. From the job accountabilities in the job description, we are then seeing that for performance, a given competency and or behavior is required. And so straight from job accountability to competency, that's the route that we're taking. So in effect, we're coming from the modeling through to jobs, job accountability into competency. That's now what we require. And so we're going to chart the whole organization's required competency. Just a point on the side that I've put in there at the bottom, qualifications and experience, and the word assumption, because we are not talking here about competencies defined as qualifications and experience. There's a big assumption that a qualification and or experience alludes to the fact that a person has a particular competency. That's an assumption, that's a leap of faith. And in effect, I'd like to just strike that out, because what qualifications and experience we look for is in some ways irrelevant to the competency. There's a presumption there that someone with a particular qualification and experience will have a particular competency. We're focusing today on the competency. And of course, this puts a huge requirement, a huge onus on the recruitment activity to make sure that the right people come in with the right competencies in the first place. So that then links, because we're saying, yes, though those are required, but what have we actually got? And of course, what we've got in existing staff will be apparent from a performance appraisal activity. And I don't incidentally mean performance appraisal as a kind of rating activity. What I'm looking at here is in effect, this slide shows the classic objective setting and performance appraisal process. But I'm not looking at it in terms of ratings. Ratings are not motivators. Ratings don't help us in this particular thing. They might be useful elsewhere, but that's another discussion. What we're really looking at here is, what are the competency gaps? What is the performance? Is the performance in line with the required competencies? Is the performance in line with the required responsibilities and accountabilities? But all that done then, and all those competency gaps established, and just to show you what a competency gap is, and you'll recognize this again if those have been on a few of these before, this is us down at the individual person level. We're seeing here in the gray axis, the gray spokes, we're seeing the gray spokes as the as-is present level in an individual, and these are there's a model of 8 competencies called the Great 8, but it could be anything. It could be the Great 20. It doesn't make any difference. A series of competencies, present level in gray, target level in yellow, and that's where we're seeing the basic competency of a basic idea of a competency gap, and the idea then of establishing what you have to do. In this particular case, I've got the levels in these competencies as trainees, supervised practitioner, practitioner, and expert. What do I have to do to get from supervised practitioner in, for example, creating and conceptualizing? What do I have to do to get to practitioner level? And that, in essence, is what it's about. So what we've got to do now is capture somehow those competency gaps. What we've got to do is capture in whom, in which person, in what job do we need those developments? in which person do we need those developments? And that then brings us to the idea of a whole organization competency framework, and therefore some kind of idea of managed training. Now, I'll give you a sneak peek, if you like, into a real competency framework, and let's see if the technology works, because I'm going to have to bounce out of this application to go into another. And oh, look, it worked. So often it doesn't, or at least not for me. So here we are. We're now looking here at Excel, and we're looking at a competency framework, and it also spawns into a training program, because that's ultimately the managed process bit of it. And we can see here one of our competencies. It's got a title, Economics and Markets Modeling. The competency is that we require somebody to be able to, or competency in, be able to participate, and competency in economic and markets modeling, estimating the contribution that the radio spectrum makes to the economy, security, and society. Big question, big thing there. And we can see that if I just go down to that, we can see that the level in this particular case is expert that's required. And what we would do is write unique competency statements for each of those levels, because they're all different, and I'll show you that in a moment. There are, incidentally, here, I think, I can't remember, there's maybe 100, maybe more rows in this spreadsheet. You can see where, incidentally, on column E, you can see where this competency comes from. It comes from section 1.5.1 of a policy statement, etc. So we're very clear where it's coming from. Why is it that the organization wants this competency? And at what level does it need it? And if I actually go along, the mouse is the wrong way around. If I actually go along a little, we see at this level that the job description, okay, it's a big high-level summary. It shows us that the specialists require this. Now, I haven't got this filled in here, but you would chart the number of these specialists needed at that level, the number existing at the level, and therefore how many of these you're going to have to increase competency in order for the organization to achieve the capability that it wants to achieve. And we can see there the different roles, especially specialists, managers, all the way down to the CEO. And what I'm going to do is just go back across and just go down and show you the on the wrong way mouse. Oh, this is good. Right, here's the practitioner. So competence in understanding and using markets and economic information computed by others. So you're not required to actually do it, but you're required to be capable of understanding what they've done. So it's slightly different, and you require a practitioner on that, and we can see if we just spin across that it's the managers that require this. And if I then go down another level, same again, understand that there is a contribution to the economy made by the spectrum and be able to discuss it and the contribution that the organization and policies make it to this. And we're saying that this level here is now the supervised practitioner, and now we need the heads of departments, the engineers and the technicians, all to be competent in that. And so we can go on. We can look at the various different competencies. We can look at the various different sources of those competencies, who is required to have the competency, and if I go right across to the far side, and what I'll do at this point is actually jump out one, otherwise I'll be here for a while. We can actually see suggestions here. Now that we know what we're trying to do, we can see the suggestions that this might be done in classroom teaching, classroom training. We can see an estimate of the number of hours required to have somebody at the level below achieve that level. And we can see, in fact, there's a thing there which says that at the moment we're only planning this, nobody's actually taking any action on this one. And we can see Here, the skills can be learned through teaching of theory, etc. So we're starting to see now how this might be done. And I'll just come out a little and give you a little bit more sight of the whole thing. So there it is, and we can go to the top. And just to show you the whole affair, I'll spin right down the bottom. You'll be seeing a lot of blurred screen, but it doesn't really matter. You'll see that each of those colors, the blue and the pink, represent a competency and behavior, or behavior, and then the 4 levels in each one. So we've got quite a significant content there, and that would then come under the management of, as I said, either the company manager or a specialist looking after this. So let's just see if the technology works. Oh, it does. And that's us back now to, we've looked at the competency framework itself. How you do it, incidentally, is actually not important. What those columns and rows actually are and what you put in is for you. It's unique to your organization. It starts with your modeling. It starts with that systems dynamics modeling. It looks at the capability you want. It asks the question, what jobs do you want doing? It then says, well, if you're going to have those jobs done, what competencies and behaviors do you need for performance? And from that, what have we got? So we're then into the gap analysis. And by the time we've done all of that, of course, we're now into where do we actually chart this? And the best way to do it is probably in something like Excel or a mind map. Perhaps a big mind map would do. So that's what we've done. We've come across the journey and we've ended with the competency framework. Then it's down to actually putting some columns in there to show who's doing it, when it's being done, what the specifics are, and most importantly, whether it was successful in taking us from where we are presently to where we actually want to be. So hopefully you've got something out of that. And I will now hand back to Sue just to see if there's any questions. Over to you, Sue.